This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
He was the toast of Vienna by this point. He's everybody's favorite Viennese composer. We're at about 1865 now or so. All things were going well for him. His career was going well. He had written a number of works that were being very, very well received. He had arranged things with Clara Schumann. They were now friends. Of course, they were never going to be lovers, just friends. And he had also had a chance to get married, Agatha von Sebold, and did not do it. He was well on the way to being a bachelor for life now. His career was going beautifully. He was a busy pianist, playing a lot of concerts and writing a lot of music that was doing very well. He had even gotten a full-time publisher now, who he had an exclusive with. However, what he did not have was international recognition yet. Brahms was still a good local musician. That's what he was. His reputation was very firm in Hamburg, of course, where he grew up, and it was very good in Vienna. It was also very good in Hanover, in Göttingen, and a few other places, but not anywhere else much. They didn't know him too well in other parts of Europe or America. Well, that was just about to change. It was time for him to break through with a work that would make him a star and would put him on the road to becoming one of the immortals. And that work is an unlikely one, to tell you the truth. You wouldn't think this would do it, but it did. He began work on his German Requiem, and a Deutsches Requiem, a German Requiem, around 1865. He got going. Now, probably the impetus was a little unusual because the impetus was not the usual. The impetus was not a performance or a publication. Most performers write for very practical reasons. Composers write for these very practical reasons. He apparently was really writing it as a memorial to his own mother, who had died, and also, finally, to Robert Schumann. And his reason, I think, for calling it a German Requiem is that Schumann had even talked about writing something, a Requiem in German, in his own diaries. And so Brahms remembered this idea that Schumann had had of this German language Requiem, and was now paying homage to Robert Schumann, who had done so much to set him on the road to his career. So that's probably the impetus behind this. However, he did not write a traditional Requiem Mass in the usual set. He did not set the Catholic liturgy for the dead. That's what a Requiem normally is. That simply would not be his style. For one thing, of course, he was a Lutheran. But for another, he was a free thinker religiously. He was spiritual. I think that's what we would call him, but was not a traditional Christian in any sense of the word. He was not a church-going type at all. So he had a kind of a very modern view, I think, of spirituality. He viewed it as being a human interaction, and he left the miraculous pretty much out of it all. So he assembled the text himself. He normally didn't do that. He usually used other texts, but he assembled itself mixing the Old and New Testaments. And I'll talk a little more in a bit about some of the things he did, because they're quite revealing of his mindset, what he chose to include and what he left out. It can be very, very interesting. A few weeks after his mother died, he wrote to Clara. He said, "Time changes everything, for better or worse. It does not so much change as it builds up and develops. And thus, when once this sad year is over, I shall begin to miss my dear good mother ever more and more." Lovely thought. We don't know a lot about his mother. She was a seamstress. She was older than her husband. The only picture we have of her is in her old age, so it's hard to see her in any other way but that. But apparently she was a wonderful person, very smart, really quite well educated. She had a lot to do with his growth and development. We'll never really know how much. It's a shady spot. But I think she was very important to him, my sense. Obviously, in death she was. So this was something he was talking about her to one of the very few people he could unburden his heart to. And then he wrote, just have a look at the beautiful words with which it begins. It is a chorus in F major without violins, but accompanied by a harp and other beautiful things. I compile the text from passages in the Bible. I hope that a German text of this sort will please you as much as the usual Latin one. I'm hoping greatly to produce a sort of the whole out of the thing and wish for enough courage and energy to carry it through. He was asking her for her blessing. Clara's opinion was everything to him. And if she had written back and had said, "Are you kidding? Drop it," we never would have had it. As it was, of course, she was, "Oh, Johannes, look what you're coming up with. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy." So it happened, of course. Of course it happened. His choice of German texts, rather than using Latin, actually reconnects him with a very old tradition. The Lutheran church music of the Baroque, remember there was a ton of that. Bach, Sebastian Bach, was largely a writer of Lutheran church music. He wrote 300 cantatas, which are basically sermons set to music, if you will. So on. He wrote those. He wrote the Passions. He wrote Masses, all of this. But the cantatas are all in German, and all of that. This was a very old tradition. And Bach was just one of hundreds and hundreds of cantors and Kapellmeisters throughout the German-speaking world who were writing this sort of stuff. Telemann wrote something like 1,500 cantatas. Yeah, I know, it's an amazing amount. And even before then, this began with the great composer Heinrich Schütz. May not be a familiar name to you. Schütz is the first German Baroque composer. He's the one who really started it all. Schütz was in Venice with Monteverdi right in the early 17th century, and then he moved into Germany, and his career was during the 30 Years' War. And so he had to go through all of those horrible deprivations at that time. But he was a very deeply spiritual Lutheran composer who left behind a very imposing body of Lutheran church music in those years when everybody was duking it out over these religions. And so Schütz actually is kind of the father of Lutheran church music in many ways. Left us a lot of very fine music. So this is this long tradition. Brahms was tapping back into that as a German. Now, one of the fascinating things is the word Jesus does not appear once in the German Requiem. Fascinating, because there's a lot of New Testament in it. His words are quoted. Jesus' words are, for example, the Beatitudes, or the opening movement, in fact. But it also has no mention of basic Christian beliefs such as the resurrection, never talks about that, or really any reference to the miraculous at all. It's completely discarded. He chooses the text to comfort the living. And it doesn't conform to traditional theology at all. And as a matter of fact, there were quite a lot of clergy who heard it in the early days, and they were very annoyed with Mr. Brahms. How can you, as a good Christian, do this? And he's like, well, I did. Live with it. But the fact of the matter is that it's beautifully done because the words are there. The quotes are there, but the man's name is not. Very interesting. Very interesting. So this is Michael Musgrave, one of our great Brahms scholars, and he writes, in Brahms' Outlook, the work was essentially humanist in conception. Its texts had essentially musical significance, not only for him as a composer, but in their existing associations. He chose his texts because they had special significance for him in the culture in which he lived, and that culture was, in its orthodoxy, Christian. But this did not hold Brahms to dogmatic associations in their use. The association was not theological, but cultural. He reminds me of Thomas Jefferson in a way, with this very open approach to that. Brahms was a very modern thinker about these sort of things. Now, Malcolm McDowell, one of his best biographers. It was not the first requiem in German. Precedents existed as far back as Schütz, but it was the first in which a composer had selected and shaped his text for essentially personal resonances to speak to a contemporary audience in a shared tongue, transcending the constraints of ritual. No liturgy here, right? A prophetic sermon from individual experience with universal application. Patience brings dignity and perspective to the mysteries of life and death, and instills a conviction of the immortality of the Spirit. If there is a God, this is how He made things, for reasons we cannot require from Him, but in whose fitness we must repose some trust. Very good. Thank you, Mr. McDowell. Very good. I think this is one of the reasons this piece speaks so well to the modern world, because it is very universal. And so the text itself can be read simply for what it says, and then you've got this rather amazing music added onto it, to say the least. Now, as he originally conceived it and as it was premiered, it had 6 movements. So it was already a pretty long piece. It was about an hour long, as it was. But in 1868, before the final premiere in Bremen, he added one more movement that he felt had to be there, and that brought the total up to the 7 that we have. It runs about 80 to 85 minutes performing time. So obviously I'm not going to play the whole piece today. I'm going to pick and choose, so on. But it is, without question, his largest work. It is without question. It was his most important work to date, without question. Without question. And it put him firmly on the map, not only in Vienna, but pretty soon, worldwide. I could talk about more later, but it was getting performed all over everywhere within 10 years of its premiere. By the 1880s, it was an established classic. So it made it very, very quickly to repertory status. A lot of very good reviews. Edward Hanslick, who was one of Brahms' strongest supporters. The German Requiem is a work of unusual significance and great mastery. It seems to us one of the ripest fruits to have emerged from the style of the late Beethoven in the field of sacred music. Hanslick always wrote like that. He was a little pompous. Referred to himself in the third person. We find these, blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh, Edward, really? Right, that. But still, he was very, very strong. Hanslick, very conservative critic, very conservative, and obviously very much in support of Brahms. He hated Wagner and Wagner's music, and Wagner made brutal fun of him in Meistersinger, when he is the pedant, right? Beckmesser. He's the pedant who's always all the rules and regulations. And it's Hanslick. As a matter of fact, his original name for the character was something like Hans Locke or something like that. And I think he only changed it because he was afraid to get sued. But Hanslick, he was a very, very great reviewer and a very, very great perceptive writer on music. Obviously, he liked Brahms. Here's an anonymous review, it's in the Bremen Courier. The Requiem was premiered in Bremen. That seems like an odd place, but it was. The Requiem of Brahms is an artistic achievement of great value. In order to be able sufficiently to estimate its worth, one must intimately understand the spirit of Schumann's compositions. Boy, now there's a perceptive critic. Whoa. Our opinion is that Brahms specifically seeks to develop this spirit, the special inclination of the master. Writer of this review knew that Schumann had been thinking about doing something like this. And that's after the Bremen performance of April 10th, 1868. Amazing. Really amazing. Not everybody liked it. Wagner was... Wagner was particularly upset by the sort of the spiritual but not religious nature. He wanted something more ritualistic, more with more liturgy. But of course, what he really was is he was just trying to find a place to stick the knife in. Compose, even if you don't have the slightest ideas. Oh, Ricard, come on, But that was him. Probably the very best all-time negative review of this piece, though. It is so good, you just cannot hold it against the writer, because very few people would have the wit to do this. This particular review comes out on almost every program note ever written about the German Requiem in every class, because it's just too good. Here it is. Mind, I do not deny that the Requiem is a solid piece of musical manufacture. You feel at once that it could only have come from the establishment of a first-class undertaker. George Bernard Shaw. The English who loved this work, and Shaw wrote in the same article, he said, the English take a creepy pleasure in requiems. I love that. So a first-class undertaker indeed. So that's Shaw. So again, not everybody was taken with it, as today not everybody is. Once in a while you hear somebody say, oh, it's so stuffy. It's so thick, all those fugues, And me, I'm going, well, that's the best part, but there it is. Well, let's begin with the first movement, yeah? Now, one of the things about the German Requiem is that it has elicited a number of fabulous recordings. Its first recording was in the 1940s, and it's just had great recordings ever since. So picking and choosing has been part of the fun. So for my first movement, I have chosen Giulini with the Vienna Philharmonic and Chorus. This is a particularly beautiful recording. Now, the very first movement really establishes the shape of things to come throughout the work. It's vast, many sections, a lot of words. Let me tell you what they are. It takes its texts from the Gospel according to Matthew 5:4, that's one of the Beatitudes, and Psalm 126. All right? And here are those texts. Matthew 5:4. Blessed are they that have sorrow, they shall be comforted. That's the first words you hear. Wonderful. Psalm 126. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. They go forth and sweep and carry precious seed and come with joy and bring their sheaves with them. In other words, the optimism, the comfort. These are the words that he's going to set over an 11-minute movement. Now, how do you set so few words over such a vast space? That's a lot of music. 11 minutes. Well, how you do it is you use a lot of themes, but you're very careful to structure them in such a way that the listener can follow along. He sets it in a very large three-part structure. Part 1 is the Matthew text. Part 1. Part 2b is the Psalm. And then we go back to part 1, becomes part 3, and an abbreviated version of that. So it's very easy. You can hear it start here, then go away from it, and come back. So that's the first thing that really helps you through this vast structure that he's writing. This is a little more technical, but it's worth mentioning, is that he explores two different keys during this, F major and D flat major. Now that's an interesting contrast because those two keys have very few points of contact between them. They're what we call distant keys. And so they're very, very different in sound. To people who associate color with keys, I do. F major to me is very green. D flat major is like a very rich purple, mauve, or like a blood red sort of sound. So they are far related keys, which means that when you move to the different key, it's going to sound very, very different. And that's why he does it. But if you're a good harmonist and you know how to do your stuff, you can move between them quite easily. And he does. I won't go into the technique behind it, but there's some very cool tricks you can do between these. Very nifty things indeed that let you move back and forth. Haydn could do this sort of thing. Beethoven could. And Brahms could. So it's very clever. Now, there are 6 main themes in this movement. That's a lot. But let me help you with them. I've given each theme a name based on either what it does or its words. So to help you out a little bit. So my names are not what anybody else's names would be, but I've tried to make them very clear. So theme number 1, almost everybody calls this the chorale theme. And the reason we do is because it probably is a Lutheran chorale melody. There's a very strong resemblance to one. It's called Wer nun den lieben Gott lasst walten, which is in some of the Bach cantatas. And so a lot of people think it probably is. Although, again, it could be coincidence. Here's the theme. I'm going to play them all on the piano for you, magically through the magic of computer technology. All right, so magic computer, here I go. Yam ba bi bum ba ba yam bum bi. It's one of the first things you hear in the piece. Now, the second doesn't really have a name, so I've called it the Selig Sind theme, because that is typically used to set those words. Now, the first time you hear it, it's right side up. It goes upwards. It's only 3 notes. It's only 3 notes. And the very first time you hear it, it's the chorus singing alone, and they sing it. Just those 3. It's almost like a little motto. Yam ba ba. Sometimes you hear it in inversion, which means it's flipped upside down, and it becomes ya ba ba, like that. So you hear it both ways, right side up, upside down. A third theme, I call this a cadence theme because it's a kind of an ending theme. It's a theme you hear when a section ends, when something is being wrapped up. It has this is the end feel to it. Okay, so it's a cadence or ending theme, and here's how it goes. You see? That's this is the end here. You know, that's that sort of sound of a theme like that. Cadential quality that you hear. Now, theme 4, which I call the Den Desolen theme, which is a rising scale line. It's so notes in a scale, rising, typically played by the oboe, more often than not, with a string kind of underneath it, and then the chorus almost always repeats it. It's a little bit more dramatic than the other themes. It's when things start moving a little bit more that you hear this. And it's as follows. Yam bi ya da di da yo. Wonderful stuff. Theme 5. I call it the Trennen theme because it's the sighs, sort of this sense of this falling idea. And so we often hear it with D meets Trennen, so you hear it with this text. And this is as follows. This is in D flat major. Ya da ti da ti. You see? La dum di. You'll hear that when the psalm setting starts. Ya dum di du. And then theme 6, the Freuden theme, which is the one really big, bright, energetic theme in here. And typically when he does this, he sets it in imitation, which means the different voices sing it back and forth like they're lobbing a volleyball around. Okay, like that. And this is much more out there, outward going. It's this. So you hear that over, and yadum bum bum boo, dum bum bum, bum bum, like that, over and around and around. So that's when it gets a little more heated. All right. So here we go. Now my chart that I'm going to show you shows you the 3 main sections on the top, and then what it is that it goes sort of more or less line by line. And if you look on the left side of the screen, you will see little lozenges or rectangles that give you the abbreviation of which theme you're hearing. And because I don't expect you to have memorized all of those, it also writes out the name of the theme as well. And it tells you what the text is as well at this point. So as much as I could make this a complete chart, I did. So Giulini, Vienna Philharmonic, glorious performance, in my humble opinion. So. Theme in the strings. David's theme. Invert it upside down. Brighter. Oboe. Davies. Orchestra. Now. D flat. And it brightens. The section ending, and then new text. notes in the Selig Zin. And energy. Nice cadence there. Then here it comes. Chorale. Listen. Right back. Choir answers. No surprise. This is technically all coda now. And chorus. Higher. Higher. Selig Zin. Cadence. But highest moment coming. Harp. What an opening. It says everything you need to know about what's to come, in so many ways. First, that this is going to be a big, serious piece. No question about it. It also tells you that it's going to be a work about comforting, because that's what it is, very much so. That it's going to be a very rigidly organized piece, because it certainly is. Even on one hearing, you can hear that. But it also establishes a few things. For example, the orchestra. That's the true Brahms orchestra. We're finally hearing it. It took him a while to learn to orchestrate in a distinctive manner. His earlier works are very well orchestrated, but they sound just like everybody else's orchestrations. But now that tendency to use the woodwind choir so beautifully together like that, and the very, very careful use of winds and strings and the little bits of color here and there, that's Brahms. That's the authentic Brahms orchestral voice. This material is so great, he brings it back again at the end of the whole piece. I mean, who wouldn't, right? I mean, come on, and do that. But the movement establishes that. Now, what follows, and let's give you an encapsulated thing here, is the next movement is a funeral march. It's a cortege. La yam bum ba yam bum ba yam bum ba. Very, very grave and formal. That movement dates all the way back to those early years during Schumann's lifetime. It was originally going to be the slow movement of his first symphony, which became his first piano concerto, and he dropped that entire movement out of it. So it just stayed in his trunk, that march, and finally it showed up in here, of course, completely, very, very, very deeply changed. The third movement that follows is one of the great big complex movements like this one, and it is the first movement to include a gigantic fugue. And in a fugue you have a melodic line that is stated, then it is copied by other melodic lines as they come in, and everything is built out of those melodic lines as you can get from them. It comes to a shattering ending. Huge, big thing. And you need a minute. You get through with that and you're like this, I had a friend who heard this for the first time, and that movement turned him off to the German Requiem. He thought it was too formal. He said, I didn't like all that fugue stuff. I said, oh, Bill, But still, I said, well, did you keep listening? And he said, no. I said, you would have loved the next movement, Bill, if you just kept listening to the doggone record. Yeah, well, I threw it away. Oh, Bill. So I never could get him back to the piece. But if I'd been able to get him to the fourth movement, he would have fallen in love with it all over again. I know that. I'm sure. Bill. The fourth movement. This has to be one of the sweetest things the man ever wrote. It has to be. I want to tell you a little bit about also the performance. This is, of all of the great recordings of the German Requiem, this might be number one on everybody's list. Otto Klemperer was a protege of Gustav Mahler's. So he goes way back into the early 20th century. In his earlier years as a conductor, he was a freelancer. He did a lot of contemporary music. He's got a lot of premieres under his belt, people like Hindemith and people like this. He had a severe problem. He was severely bipolar. And when he went into the swing side of the bipolar disorder, he went a little crazy. He'd disappear and be found out drinking in all sorts of low dives and getting in police trouble and fights and all of this. He was also, the poor man was horrendously accident prone. For example, he fell down a flight of stairs at one point and hurt himself badly. At one point later in his life, he was smoking in bed, never a smart thing to do. And he fell asleep and he set the bed on fire. When he woke up, he reached for the first thing to put it out. Well, his masseur had been in a while before, and it was a bottle of camphor. And so horribly burned, all of this. He had a brain tumor at one point that left him partially disabled. And he was considered pretty much box office poison by most of the major orchestras. Now, he did stand at the helm of the LA Philharmonic for a while in the 40s. That was his orchestra. And he had a few appointments hither and yon, but most people wouldn't touch him because he was considered so dangerous and unreliable, despite the fact that at his best, when he was on, He was the equivalent of anyone. Anyone. He was the equivalent of a Bruno Walter or a Toscanini or anybody else. He was one of these great masters of the great German repertory. Well, it seemed like that was going to be it. And then, in the mid-1950s, the conductor Herbert von Karajan, the German conductor, who had been the head of the Philharmonia Orchestra in London, that had been his orchestra, had been offered the lifetime position of the Berlin Philharmonic. So Karajan left the Philharmonia, which left this great orchestra. That was London's finest orchestra. And they were largely a recording orchestra. That's what they were for. It left them without a conductor. Walter Legge, the great producer of this orchestra, who'd built the orchestra from scratch, thought, we could get Klemperer. And I'm sure the whole board in EMI went and said, no, and all this. But he said, no, let's do it. Come on, Well, he was Walter Legge, so they did it. They hired Klemperer, and he had this amazing Indian summer of his career for 10 years. Klemperer and the Philharmonia left us a bounty of great recordings. There's a stack of them this high on CD now. In America, they came out on Angel Records. In Europe, they were on his master's voice. And they're uneven, but that is one of the great Beethoven sets there is. Klemperer and the Philharmonia. The Brahms 4 symphonies cannot be touched. The Bach B minor Mass they did is one of the great ones. It's very slow, but it's great. Klemperer was at his best at these great works. And in the German Requiem, which he recorded the creme de la creme, he had Elizabeth Schwarzkopf for his soprano, he had Hans Hotter, he had the Philharmonia, which is one of the greatest orchestras the world has ever known, in my opinion, in its day. And he had a crackerjack recording team at EMI. They gave him everything he needed and all the time he wanted and everything he did. Man, this thing's perfect. It's still out there. You can actually download it all remastered in high definition digital and all of that. This is truly a classic recording. And I think in this performance you'll hear exactly what I mean by that. Now, this movement, it takes its text from Psalm 84, lines 1, 2, and 4. And the text is as follows. How lovely are thy dwelling places, O Lord of hosts. My soul requires and yearns for the court of the Lord. My body and soul rejoice in the living God. Blessed are they that dwell in thy house. They praise you forever. To set it, he writes a slow Landler. A Landler is the predecessor of the waltz. Sound of Music, Julie Andrews, Christopher Plummer dance one. Da da dee da dum, ba da dee dee dim bum, ba da dum, ya da dee da da. This is a Landler. It's even slower. It's even slower. And this lovely, lovely, lovely slow Landler. It's dreamy. It's nostalgic for a past that probably never was. It's without any real complications. There's no big problems with it. I don't have to do a fancy chart for this one. So I decided to do images of sacred places from all the world's great religions. That seemed right for this piece, right? Because it's just not a Christian work. It's a Buddhist work. It's a Taoist work. It's a Jewish work. It's a Muslim work. It's a everything work. And I think this movement, of all of the movements of the Requiem, is the one that to me gets closest in some ways to that wonderful, simple spirit of the thing. The comfort, the optimism, the love that is so much permeates this piece. Here we go. amplify, of course. Reconstruction of the temple, the second temple. It is. It's, yes. Mhm. Yeah. That's a computerized model of the Second Temple. That's what it is. Yes. Ah. And I did include a Christian image in there, by the way. There was a CC was in there, so. So I see that. What wonderful stuff. You know, one little postscript and we'll take our break. This piece has attracted the attention of the historically informed performance groups. And they're performing it on original instruments, which seems odd. 1860s, you know, it's not like Baroque or something. But they are showing some interesting insights to it, a clarity and certain sounds in it. They're worth hearing. Although I have to tell you that of the three I know, there's a Gardner, John Elliott Gardner, and a Roger Norrington, and another one. All of them dropped the ball with this movement. Oh. They all do it too fast. Oh. Da dee da dee da dee 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 dee. You feel like kind of getting on your ice skates, and going for it. And so I do think you need someone like Klemperer to bring out the beauty of this movement. Someone who's willing to give it the time and the breadth that it deserves. Giulini could do it, Klemperer could do it, and we're going to find out on our second half, Herbert Blomstedt could do it. Yes. Let's take our break, okay? Here we go. So we have just finished the fourth movement, that beautiful, lovely, comforting Ländler. And the fifth movement is a rarity in this piece in that it's a solo movement. This is not like the Verdi Requiem, where there are a lot of big solo arias. This is a work with one solo, and that's it. The fifth movement, gorgeous, beautiful, wonderful thing. And then it's time for the sixth. This is the great monolithic movement of the German Requiem. This is the whopper, the biggie. And I've chosen among our modern recordings what is, in my opinion, one of the very best. During Herbert Blomstedt's 10 years here at the helm of the San Francisco Symphony, it's right before Michael Tilson Thomas, Blomstedt signed us a contract with Decca, the great English recording company, and the orchestra with Decca made about 68 separate pieces, recorded them. Beautifully done. The recordings are not only beautifully performed, but the recording quality of them is miraculous. To make sure that everything was done right, among other things, they built a great big platform out into the seating area of Davies Symphony Hall and put half the orchestra on that. They would not allow any of the ventilation systems to be on during recordings because they made a little bit of noise and they wouldn't have it. So instead, they brought in their own for that, and they brought in generators that they had outside in that parking lot in the back with wires running in to do it. So it was very, very quiet. Blomstedt, for his part, was very fussy about the spontaneity of a recording. So his rule was that they did 3 complete run-throughs of any given movement first, after lots of rehearsal. Did that, and then if they needed to do any spot editing, do a little bit here or there for a muffed note or something, they would do it. So in other words, the recordings are very similar in some ways to the live recordings, such as we get from the symphony now. Many of the symphony's recordings are made now from live concerts, and they've been spliced together. But these were made in a similar fashion, except under much more controlled circumstances. They have always been considered some of the very best orchestra conductor recordings made in that era. What happened to them is, unfortunately, the 1980s and into the 90s, the market was glutted with classical CDs, and they got ignored. Many of the Blomstedt San Francisco recordings had a shelf life of about 10 minutes, and then they just disappeared. And they didn't get reprinted or anything like that. They just disappeared. And so you had to be a connoisseur and go find them. Then a company, Archive CD, started reissuing them in reprints. And finally, 2 years ago, Decca brought out a retrospective set, Herbert Blomstedt in San Francisco, and they hired me to write the liner notes for it, in fact, and so it's my notes in there. What always upset me about it, they didn't ask me, so I couldn't say, but they didn't do all of them. They only did about half of them. And among there is the best modern Sibelius set there is. Of the Sibelius symphonies, I think the best Carl Nielsen set ever. But they did at least get the Eroica Symphony, which they did, which is a king among the Eroica performances, and quite a few others as well. One of the ones that has stayed in print, though it never was allowed to go out of print, was their German Requiem. This was amazing, and it won a Grammy Award as well. This was a Grammy Award winning for the chorus, which it certainly should have been. Also, I think it deserves it for not only the orchestra, for the vocal soloist. I think Blomstedt really should have had one too, because this is one of the great, great requiems. It's got that Klemperer spread to it, that great sweep that Klemperer gives it, but it also has that unique lyrical sweetness that the San Francisco Symphony has that is rather rare, that silky, beautiful sound that our orchestra has so beautifully. Wonderful, wonderful recording of this, and that's why I've chosen it for our third movement, is Blomstedt and San Francisco Symphony and Chorus. If they had only made this one recording, I think it would make them a legend of these recordings. As it is, they did a lot of other ones, including, by the way, a whole CD of Brahms's other chorus and orchestra works, like the Alto Rhapsody and so on. Marvelous. Get that retrospective from Decca. You can read my notes, and all of that, and have those. So, the sixth movement is a vast canvas. It's in 4 very large parts. The topic is the apocalypse, the sounding of the last trumpet, but instead of being full of fire and brimstone and you're all going to hell, have fun, it's more in the way that it's going to be okay, folks. Everything's all right. That's the message of this piece. And this one, it shouts it from the rooftops. That message. Okay? Great fugal writing, fugues, these things where you have the one voice come in, another one copy, and another one copy, and another one copy. This is probably the best fugal writing in a choral work since the Beethoven Missa Solemnis. It's one of the truly, truly great ones. And this performance, clear as a bell. Clear as a bell. Marvelous stuff. Michael Steinberg, in his program notes for this, writes, there is not a trace of theatrical effect here. He's taking a dig at Verdi there, by the way. Brahms does it on sheer harmonic energy, which reaches overwhelming dimensions in the hugely swinging sequences. I'll point those out when we get to them. There, when it's, where is thy sting? Where is thy sting? These great big sequences, and they're wonderful. My favorite part, I always turn the volume up when I get to those. I always love those. Okay? Now, the first part, Hebrews 13, 14, and Corinthians, for we have no abiding city, but we seek one to come. There's a lot of vocal solos in here as well. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed, and that quickly, in a moment, at the sound of the last trumpet. And all you know what breaks loose at that moment. Okay? For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. Wow, this is really cool. Then shall be fulfilled the word that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Taught, right? Death. And they almost shout it. Taught, where is thy sting? Taught, taught, hell, where is your victory? And of course the answer is, it isn't. Big, huge fugue. That's wonderful. Lord, you are worthy to receive praise and glory and power. It's huge Cinerama music. It's great stuff. For you have created all things, the second fugue, and by your will were they created and have their being. Lord, you are worthy to receive praise and glory and power. Solo.
selbige plötzlich in einem Augenblick zu der
Builds
Zeit
up.
der
Here we go. episode. Everything's smushed together. Oh my, what a movement it is. At that point, it's all over but the screaming, basically, in this piece. You know, the German Requiem is one of those works, though. It's like the Tchaikovsky Sixth Symphony that almost everybody thinks that's the end. And they also go, yay! You know, and then the orchestra's going to play another movement. You know, it's like the Tchaik Six, right? And it's a slow movement. What happens for the end, the last movement, is to return to the mood of the first. And it has this beautiful, beautiful, calm, wonderful ending to it like that. Beautiful thing. So the work really does finish off. Well, that would have made a cool ending, but what he did even better, I think, with that slower movement. So it's one of those pieces. But be one of the ones in the know. You go to a live performance of this and you get to the end of that and the people around you are applauding. You can sit there going, peasants. You know. So after all, as you sit there secure in your knowledge, there's more. So yes. Well, I got to tell you, it put him on the international map. It was getting played all over, everywhere. And that's something because this is no small undertaking. You've got to have a big chorus, you've got to have a big orchestra, you've got to have vocal soloists, and they've got to practice the daylights out of it. This is not something you sight read and throw together. Came here pretty early, too. We had it in Boston, you know, places like that. As I said, it wasn't and isn't without its critics. To this day, there are people that have brickbats to throw at it, and so on. I don't know how they can do that. It has sometimes been said that the people who love the Verdi Requiem don't like this one, but I don't see why you can't love them both. I do, you know. So, and the clerical types have often been uncomfortable with it from the get-go, and they still are, actually. I mean, that's, you know, because, again, it doesn't do all the stuff they want it to do, you know. And as a matter of fact, some of the early performances, Brahms was actually approached by church leaders who wanted him to rewrite the text. Yeah, he was polite, I hope, about it, but I think he told them where to stick it, you know. In his own very polite way, of course, in his polite way. It is his longest composition, and by a mile, really by a mile, but it has as many recordings as almost anything else he ever wrote, except for the First Symphony. I have a friend who has 165 recordings of the First Symphony. I know. And he can tell you details about all of them, oh yeah, I've been drawn from 1947, so, oh my God, you need to get out more. But but among the great recordings of this, for example, I've given you three fairly recent: Giulini, Vienna, Klemperer, Philharmonia, and Blomstedt here. But for example, Herbert von Karajan, when he was quite young, he did a recording in Vienna just 2 years after the end of World War II. It's quite an amazing document. Now, as far as performances go, it's a little, but it doesn't matter. The Vienna Philharmonic had been devastated, as we know, by the war. It had been a terrible time for them. Many of the choir, these people were practically starving, and yet they made this happen. They made it happen with primitive recording equipment and with what they could do, and it's worth hearing for just that alone. And it's also a very moving performance because the urgency, the love, the energy that's there transcends any amount of orchestra bloopers and out-of-tune singing, of which there's quite a bit. And some of it sounds like it's coming out of a Dixie cup and string, But in some ways, it's one of the most moving performances the piece you'll ever hear. So well worth hearing, and so on. Well worth it. Quite amazing, really. To think of it that he looked more or less like that about this time. The beard was just about to come, by the way. I think that Brahms in midlife, I think he got tired of people coochie-cooing him all the time. He was such a good-looking man and all that, and he looked about 20 years younger than he was. When he was 40, he looked like an undergraduate, and when he was 20, he looked like he was 10, right? So all of that. So the beard started happening, and the girth started happening. And before you know it, you had Brahms, the spherical bearded one, walking around, So with that, it did happen. It did happen. The pressure of this great work, that this success put a great deal of pressure on him. He was the great German composer of his era. He and Wagner had it sewn up, really, and they were in completely different worlds. And he was well on the way to becoming an immortal. The German Requiem probably would have done it if he hadn't done anything else. So, when? When, Johannes? When? When are we going to get the 10th Symphony, John? And of course, they were calling it that. The 10th Symphony, Beethoven 9, 10, right? Yeah. When are you going to write a symphony, John? Symphonies were in terrible shape. We'll be talking about this. It was in bad shape at that point. When are you going to repair it? When are you going to rescue European music? When are you going to be the hero? When are you going to be Superman? When? Poor John. Well, what they didn't know is they'd been working on it for quite a while. As a matter of fact, he'd written a first symphony and abandoned it. It had become the first piano concerto. In fact, there were 3 movements of it finished. Pretty much. Not completely, but pretty close. And they're the ones we have now. Pretty much. All that remained is he had to write a 4th movement. And he just couldn't do it. Of course, he eventually did. And that will be the topic of our next class. Thank you very much. Thank you.